Our story begins in northeast Brazil in April of 1977. Apolinario Correa and his three brothers, Firmino, Oriano, and Jose, were hard workers. They made their living in a tough but honest way. They were lumberjacks, but not in the traditional sense of working in a vast forest. Their territory was a small, uninhabited island just off the coast called Ilha dos Caranguejos, or Crab Island. The brothers had a sturdy boat, and they'd make regular trips out to the island, chop down valuable timber, load it onto their boat, and sail back to the mainland to sell it to local construction companies. It was a good business. The wood from Crab Island was high quality, and because they were the only ones willing to go there, they had the whole place to themselves. And there was a very specific reason they were the only ones willing to go there. Most people in their coastal community were terrified of Crab Island. For generations, stories had been passed down. Spooky stories. People who had dared to venture onto the island, maybe for a picnic or to explore, would come back with unsettling tales. They'd talk about hearing strange voices whispering from deep within the island's dense forest, especially after the sun went down. This was particularly strange because everyone knew for a fact that nobody lived on the island. There were no homes, no shacks, nothing. And then there were the lights. Fishermen out on the water at night would sometimes see bizarre, colorful lights flashing and dancing above the treetops of Crab Island, with no logical explanation. It was a place steeped in local folklore, a place most people gave a wide berth. But the Correa brothers were practical men. Apolinario, the oldest, was level-headed. Firmino was strong and quiet. Oriano was the joker of the group, and Jose, the youngest, looked up to them all. They had heard the stories their whole lives, but they just didn't buy into them. To them, the whispers were just the wind in the trees, and the lights were probably just swamp gas or some other natural phenomenon. The fear their neighbors had was actually a business advantage. It meant no competition. So, they went to Crab Island all the time, and it was always the same. Just them, the trees, and the sound of the ocean. It was just another job site. On the morning of the 25th of April, 1977, the four brothers readied their boat for another trip. The plan was simple, the same one they'd executed dozens of times. They would set off in the morning and aim to arrive at the island around noon, which was high tide. This was important because the waters around Crab Island were very shallow, surrounded by vast mudflats. You could only get the boat close to the shore during high tide. They'd anchor the boat, wade to the island, and spend the entire afternoon felling trees. As the tide went out, their boat would eventually come to rest on the soft mud, stranded until the tide came back in. This was all part of the plan. They didn't intend to sail back right away. They'd finish their work, cook dinner over a campfire on the beach, and then head back to the boat to get a few hours of sleep. By the time they woke up around midnight, the next high tide would have lifted their boat free from the mud, and they could begin the peaceful journey home under the stars. It was a solid, well-rehearsed plan. And so, that's exactly what they did. They arrived at Crab Island at about 12 p.m., the sun high in the sky. The day was hot and humid, and the work was grueling. For hours, the only sounds on the island were the rhythmic thud of their axes against wood and the crash of falling trees. They worked until their muscles ached and their shirts were soaked with sweat. As evening approached, the sky turned a brilliant orange and purple. They gathered up their tools and built a small, crackling campfire on the beach. They cooked their simple dinner of fish and rice, talking and laughing as they always did. They probably made fun of the ghost stories, feeling perfectly safe and content on their island. Around 8 p.m., after they'd finished eating, Apolinario took a bucket of seawater and carefully doused the campfire, making sure every last ember was extinguished. The only light now came from the moon, casting long shadows across the beach. The tide was fully out. Their boat was sitting about 100 yards away, a dark silhouette resting on the glistening mudflats. The four brothers took off their boots, rolled up their pants, and began the familiar trudge through the thick, ankle-deep mud towards their vessel. They climbed aboard, rinsed the mud from their feet, and went into the small main cabin. It was cramped, but it was shelter. They laid out their sleeping pads on the floor, and exhausted from the day's labor, it didn't take long for all four of them to fall into a deep, dreamless sleep. Apolinario had only meant to sleep for a few hours, just until the tide came back in. But when he opened his eyes again, he knew instantly that something was wrong. The air inside the cabin was still and dark, but through the small porthole window, he could see that the sky outside wasn't black anymore. It was that soft, hazy pink of early dawn. He let out a frustrated groan. They had all slept right through the midnight high tide. Their boat had been lifted by the water, and then, as the tide receded again, it had settled right back down into the mud. They were stuck. Again. Now they'd have to wait all the way until the next high tide, likely around noon. A whole half-day wasted. Annoyed, Apollinario sat up and looked around the small cabin to see if his brothers were awake. He saw the familiar lumps of his two brothers, Firmino and Jose, still asleep on their pads. They each had their thin blankets pulled up right over their faces to block out the morning light. But then his eyes fell on the third sleeping pad, the one belonging to his brother, Oriano. It was empty. The blanket was tossed aside. Oriano wasn't in the cabin. Apollinario wasn't immediately alarmed. Oriano was an early riser. He was probably just outside on the deck, getting some fresh air, or answering the call of nature. But just as Apollinario was thinking this, the sound hit him. A piercing, blood-curdling scream from just outside the cabin door. It was a sound of absolute, unimaginable pain. It was Oriano's voice. In a split second, Apollinario's annoyance at oversleeping was replaced by a jolt of pure adrenaline and fear. He scrambled to his feet, threw open the cabin door, and rushed out onto the deck. And what he saw made him freeze in his tracks. There was his brother, Oriano, standing there, clutching at his own body, his face twisted in a mask of agony. His skin, all of his exposed skin on his face, his neck, his arms, was a mess of horrific burns. It looked like someone had taken a blowtorch to him. It was red and blistering, and in some places, it looked like it was literally peeling away from the muscle. Apollinario was so horrified he couldn't move. His brain just couldn't process what he was seeing. And then, through the shock, he noticed something that was even stranger, something that made absolutely no sense. Despite the terrible burns that covered his brother's body, Oriano's clothes, his simple work shirt and pants, were perfectly fine. They weren't scorched, they weren't singed, there wasn't a single mark on them. It was as if his skin had spontaneously caught on fire from the inside out, while leaving his clothes completely untouched. Oriano was just screaming and screaming, stumbling around the deck in pure agony, and Apollinario had no idea what to do, no idea what could have possibly caused this. While Apollinario stood there, frozen in shock, he heard another sound. This one was coming from back inside the cabin where he had just been. It was a low, guttural moaning, a sound of deep suffering. Acting on pure instinct, he spun around and ran back into the cabin. He knew the sound was coming from one of his other two brothers, who were still under their blankets. He lurched towards the closest one, Firmino, and tore the blanket off of him. The sight was just as horrifying as what he'd seen on deck. Firmino was writhing on his sleeping pad, moaning in pain, and his skin was just as horribly burned as Oriano's. It was raw and red, and looked like it was sliding off his body. And just like with Oriano, Firmino's clothes were completely undamaged. Apollinario's mind was reeling. What was happening? Was this a nightmare? His eyes darted over to his last brother Jose, who was still lying on his sleeping pad, the blanket still covering him. He was quiet. He wasn't moaning. Maybe he was okay. With a trembling hand, Apollinario reached over and pulled back Jose's blanket. Jose was not burned. There wasn't a mark on him. But he was not okay. His eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling of the cabin. He wasn't breathing. Jose was dead. The next 6 hours must have been the longest and most torturous of Apollinario's life. He was on a tiny boat, stuck in the mud, on a supposedly haunted island. His brother Oriano was outside, still screaming in agony from his mysterious burns. His brother Firmino was inside, barely conscious and fading fast from his own horrific injuries. And his youngest brother Jose was lying dead just a few feet away. There was nothing he could do. He couldn't call for help, they had no radio, and he couldn't leave. He had to simply wait surrounded by death and suffering, for the tide to slowly, agonizingly creep back in and lift their boat from the mud. He tried to comfort his injured brothers, to give them water, to do anything, but he was completely helpless. Finally, around noon, the water was high enough, the boat lifted, and Apollinario was free. He started the engine and raced back towards the mainland, his mind a chaotic storm of grief and confusion. When they finally reached their home port, a small crowd gathered, shocked at the scene. Oriano, who was badly hurt but still conscious and able to walk, stayed behind with the body of their brother Jose, waiting for the authorities. Apollinario knew Firmino's injuries were the most severe. He was slipping in and out of consciousness, and his body looked like it was shutting down. Apollinario had to get him to a hospital, and fast. He managed to get his brother into a vehicle and sped off towards the nearest medical facility. When they arrived at the hospital, doctors and nurses rushed out to help. Firmino was barely clinging to life. As they got him onto a gurney and started wheeling him into the emergency room, a doctor leaned in close to him. The doctor knew they needed to understand what had happened to treat these bizarre injuries. He asked Firmino, "What happened? How did you get these burns?" Firmino's eyes fluttered open. He was barely able to speak, his voice a hoarse whisper. But right before he slipped into a deep coma from his burns, he was able to get out a few chilling words. He told the doctor that sometime during the night, while they were all asleep in the boat on Crab Island, he had woken up for a moment. He had looked out the small porthole window from inside the cabin. And what he saw, he said, was an inexplicable ball of fire just hovering in the air outside the boat. And that was the last thing he remembered. The local police were notified immediately, and they opened an investigation into the bizarre and tragic events on Crab Island. They were faced with a case that seemed to defy all logic. One man dead with no apparent cause, two men with catastrophic burns that seemed to appear out of nowhere, and one man, Apollinario, who was completely unharmed and completely bewildered. The first person they spoke to at length was Apollinario. He told them everything he could remember, from their normal workday to the horrifying discovery in the morning. He was clearly traumatized, and his story, as strange as it was, seemed genuine. The investigators had to consider all possibilities, no matter how unlikely. Their first theory was that some sort of fight had broken out among the brothers. Maybe an argument over money or work had escalated into extreme violence. Perhaps Apollinario was lying to cover up his own involvement. But this theory quickly fell apart. The Correa brothers were known to be very close. There was no history of violence or serious arguments between them. And, more importantly, this theory couldn't explain the physical evidence. How could a fight result in two men being burned so severely while their clothes remained untouched? And how did Jose die without a single mark on him? An autopsy would later be performed on Jose, and the coroner was stumped. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, likely brought on by extreme shock or terror. But what had terrified him to death? The police then considered the possibility of drugs or alcohol. Maybe the men had consumed some sort of hallucinogen, and in their altered state they had hurt themselves or each other. This could potentially explain their strange stories and lack of memory. But toxicology reports were run on all the brothers, including Jose. They all came back completely clean. There were no drugs, no unusual levels of alcohol, nothing in their systems that could explain what had happened. So, the investigators moved on to environmental factors. The most plausible, though still far-fetched, theory they could come up with was a freak lightning strike. Their idea was that maybe lightning had struck the wet beach or the water near the boat, and somehow the electrical charge had reflected off the sand or the water and shot into the boat, striking the men. But the experts they consulted said this was incredibly unlikely. A lightning strike powerful enough to inflict those kinds of burns would have left obvious signs of its passing. It would have scorched the boat, maybe blown a hole in the hull, or damaged the boat's electronics. But when the police forensics team went out to Crab Island to examine the boat and the surrounding area, they found nothing. The boat was completely undamaged. There were no scorch marks, no signs of an explosion or a fire. The beach was pristine. There were no unusual craters or fused sand that a lightning strike would leave behind. In fact, the big takeaway from the on-site investigation was that they found absolutely no evidence of anything unusual happening at all. It was as if the island itself was hiding its secrets. The only piece of information that pointed to something truly strange was Firmino's dying declaration about the ball of fire. The police had to consider it, but what could they do with it? To them, it sounded like the hallucination of a man in extreme pain and shock. A ball of fire hovering in the air? It sounded like something from a science fiction story, not a police report. With no physical evidence, no witnesses who could remember anything, and no logical explanation, the investigation hit a dead end. Miraculously, both Firmino and Oriano survived. They spent months in the hospital undergoing painful treatments and skin grafts. They eventually made full physical recoveries. But the mental and emotional scars remained. And strangest of all, neither of them ever regained any memory of what happened that night. Their last clear memory was of going to sleep in the cabin. The next thing they knew, they were in unimaginable pain. The period in between was a complete and total blank. With their two key witnesses unable to provide any details, and with a total lack of evidence, the police had no choice but to close the case. The official file on the death of Jose Correa and the injuries of his brothers was stamped unsolved, with no official explanation ever given. The Correa family was left to grieve without answers, and the terrifying mystery of Crab Island only grew deeper. For 9 years, life went on. The surviving Correa brothers never returned to Crab Island. They found other ways to make a living. But the story of what happened to them became a legendary cautionary tale in their community. The island, which had always been considered haunted, was now seen as a place of genuine, tangible danger. People avoided it more than ever. The strange stories, however, didn't stop. Fishermen continued to report seeing odd lights in the sky over the island. But for 9 years, no one was brave or foolish enough to spend the night there. Then, in April of 1986, almost 9 years to the day after the Correa brothers' ordeal, a different crew of men decided to tempt fate. It was a team of 4 lumberjacks, unrelated to the Correas, who were new to the area. They heard that the timber on Crab Island was plentiful and untouched. They likely heard the stories as well, but just like the Correa brothers before them, they probably dismissed them as superstitious nonsense. They were there to do a job and make money, not to hunt for ghosts. Their plan was almost identical to the one the Correas had used. They sailed to the island, spent the day harvesting lumber, and as evening fell, they settled in for the night, planning to leave on the next high tide. They were out in the woods, not far from the beach, when suddenly all 4 of them recalled hearing a single, loud, crashing sound echo through the forest. It was a noise they couldn't identify. And right after they heard that sound, all 4 of them, at the exact same moment, simply fell unconscious. They didn't feel sick, they didn't feel dizzy. It was like a switch was flipped and their consciousness was just turned off. When they woke up again, it was 18 hours later. They were disoriented, confused, with massive gaps in their memory. As they slowly came to their senses and took stock of their situation, a horrifying sense of déjà vu fell over the island. One of the 4 men was dead. He had no visible injuries, no marks on his body. He was just gone. And another one of the men was inexplicably covered in severe burns. And just like with Firmino and Oriano 9 years earlier, the survivors' clothes were perfectly intact. The 2 other men were unharmed, but in a state of shock. When authorities investigated this second incident, they were faced with the exact same impossible puzzle. The survivors had no memory of what happened between hearing the crashing sound and waking up 18 hours later. The autopsy on the deceased man was, once again, inconclusive, pointing to a probable heart attack induced by terror. And the man with the burns couldn't explain how he got them. A thorough search of the island once again revealed nothing. No footprints, no scorch marks, no evidence of any kind. It was a near-perfect carbon copy of the tragedy that had befallen the Correa brothers. The 2 incidents, separated by 9 years, are so chillingly similar that it's hard to dismiss them as coincidence. In both cases, a group of lumberjacks spent the night on the island. In both cases, one person died of unexplained causes, appearing to be scared to death. In both cases, at least one other person suffered severe, unexplainable burns that did not affect their clothing. And in both cases, the survivors had complete amnesia of the event itself. So, what is really happening on Crab Island? To this day, no one knows for sure. The official case files remain closed and unsolved. But there are theories, though they venture far from conventional explanations. Some people believe the island is home to a paranormal entity, a malevolent spirit that attacks those who trespass on its territory. The voices and the lights that people have reported for decades could be signs of this presence. Others look towards a more extraterrestrial explanation. The description Firmino gave of a ball of fire hovering in the air sounds very similar to many UFO sightings, specifically reports of ball lightning or unidentified aerial phenomena. The burns, which spared clothing, are consistent with injuries caused by intense microwave radiation, a technology often associated with advanced non-human craft. Perhaps these men stumbled upon something not of this world, something that reacted defensively and with lethal force. Whatever the truth is, the story of the Korea brothers and the second crew serves as a haunting reminder that there are still mysteries in this world that we cannot explain. For the families involved, there is no closure, only the lingering pain of loss and the endless, unanswerable question of what truly happened on those nights. Crab Island remains uninhabited, a place of quiet beauty by day and a place of profound, terrifying mystery by night. It stands as a silent monument to a series of events that defy logic and blur the line between folklore and a dark, terrifying reality. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. In the very early hours of the 27th of March 2003, a 4-year-old boy was lying in his bed in a small farmhouse in rural Ohio. He heard his bedroom door creak open. He figured it was probably just his great-grandparents, Jack and Linda, coming in to check on him like they sometimes did. So, being a little kid, he just squeezed his eyes shut and pretended to be sound asleep. He heard the floorboards groan as whoever it was walked slowly across the room. He could hear them getting closer and closer. And then the sounds stopped. They were standing right next to his bed, looking down at him. He could almost feel them there. His curiosity got the better of him. He opened his eyes, just a tiny crack, just enough to peek. But what he saw standing there in the dark was not his great-grandmother or his great-grandfather. It was a huge green monster. On the evening of Wednesday, the 26th of March 2003, a 55-year-old woman named Linda Myers was driving her car down a quiet, 2-lane road in Darkey County, Ohio. Darkey County was the kind of place that was mostly made up of very small towns, separated by huge stretches of farmland. It was peaceful. As Linda drove, the sun was setting over a wide-open field, casting long shadows across the road. She was on her way home from the pizza shop that she and her husband Jack owned together in a nearby town. It was a normal end to a normal day. Eventually, Linda turned off the paved road and onto a long gravel driveway. This led to the sprawling 40-acre farm where she and Jack lived. She parked her car in front of their old farmhouse, a place that felt like home in every way. She reached into the back seat and grabbed the deposit bag. It was full of the cash earnings from the pizza shop for that day. She got out of the car, and the quiet of the countryside settled around her. The farm was so isolated that you couldn't hear any traffic from the main road. The only sounds were the sheep bleating softly in the pasture and the hum of power tools coming from the big barn out back. She walked around to the back of the barn, and there was Jack. He was hunched over the engine of a beat-up old car, tinkering away. Jack and Linda had been married for about 7 years. This was Linda's third marriage, but with Jack, she truly felt like she had found her soulmate. He was a hard worker. On top of co-owning the pizza shop with Linda, he also had a full-time job at a manufacturing plant. And as if that wasn't enough, he ran a side business restoring classic cars. Linda often found him out here working on a car as the sun went down. It was just who he was. Sitting in the grass next to the car, playing with a small wrench, was Linda's 4-year-old great-grandson, Damien. The moment Damien saw Linda, his face lit up with a huge smile. He dropped the wrench, jumped to his feet, and ran over to give her a big, tight hug. Seeing Damien's happy face always made Linda feel a little bittersweet. Damien was the son of her granddaughter, Amber. But Amber had gotten pregnant when she was only 14 years old. She was just a child herself and wasn't in any position to raise a baby. So, Linda and Jack had stepped in. They offered to take Damien and raise him for a few years, just until Amber could finish high school and get her life on a stable track. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, and it came with its own set of problems. One of the biggest problems was Damien's father. He was furious about being cut out of the custody agreement and having limited access to his son. Even now, 4 years later, he still argued with Linda about it. He would insist that he wanted to be a part of Damien's life, but Linda was worried. She had a deep fear that he would eventually just abandon the boy, and she couldn't bear the thought of her great-grandson going through that kind of pain. So, she kept him at a distance. Besides, Linda thought Damien was going to have another father figure in his life very soon. In the past few years, Amber had really turned her life around. She had finished school, she had met a wonderful new man, and they had gotten married. Their plan was to take Damien in and raise him themselves as soon as he finished his current year of preschool, which was only a couple of months away. Linda was incredibly proud of Amber and how much she had matured. But she also felt a pang of sadness. She and Jack were going to miss having Damien around the farm. They loved him more than anything. In many ways, he was like their own son. Linda could see that Jack was completely focused on the car engine and probably didn't want to be interrupted. So she just said a quick hello to him, then scooped Damien up into her arms and carried him toward the farmhouse. She opened the back door, set Damien down inside, and told him to go wash his hands for dinner. Then she walked into the kitchen and tossed the deposit bag from the pizza shop onto a chair in the dining room. The bag was full of cash, and her plan was to take it to the bank first thing in the morning. Linda got a pan out and started cooking dinner. A few minutes later, her husband Jack came inside, his hands and arms covered in car grease. While Jack washed up at the kitchen sink, Linda asked him how his day had been. Jack just grumbled a bit. He was annoyed about a customer he'd sold a car to on a payment plan the year before. The customer had now missed 3 payments in a row. Jack said he was going to have to drive out to the guy's house the next day and repossess the car. Linda could tell Jack was tense, but she knew it wasn't just about the missed car payment. The truth was, Jack had been on edge for the past week or so. It all started after he had a huge argument with his 25-year-old son, Greg. Greg had always been a shy, mild-mannered kid who was really close with his dad. He had even been the best man at Jack and Linda's wedding. But recently, Greg's life seemed to be falling apart. He was going through a messy divorce, he was struggling with drinking and drug abuse, and he had been skipping shifts at his job. Earlier that month, Greg had come to the farm asking Jack for money. He said his house was about to be foreclosed on. But Jack had decided it was time for some tough love. He drew a line in the sand and said no. He told Greg that if he wanted to keep his house, he needed to clean up his act and get back to work. That conversation had turned into a massive fight. Now, Linda had a feeling that Jack was genuinely worried he had done permanent damage to his relationship with Greg. He was probably afraid that history was repeating itself. Something similar had happened with Jack's other son, Travis, about 7 years earlier. When Travis was 21, he and Jack had gotten into an argument that was so bad, Travis packed his bags, moved out, and they hadn't spoken a single word to each other since. 7 years of silence. Linda thought Jack must be terrified that the same thing was about to happen with Greg. So, while Jack stood at the sink scrubbing the grease from his hands, Linda came up behind him and gently rubbed his shoulders. She told him not to worry so much about Greg. She said Greg had a good head on his shoulders and just needed a little push to get back on the right track. That's all Jack had done. She reassured him that he'd made the right decision and that Greg would get through this rough patch. After that, Linda set the table and called everyone for dinner. A little while later, after they had all eaten and cleaned up the kitchen, Linda glanced up at the clock. She realized it was getting pretty late. Damien had preschool in the morning, and she didn't want him to be tired and cranky. So she picked him up and carried him upstairs to his room to get him ready for bed. She helped him change into his pajamas, brushed his teeth for him, and then tucked him into his bed. She gave him a kiss on his forehead, whispered good night, and quietly closed the door behind her. Linda went back downstairs. Before long, she and Jack were getting ready for bed too. A short time later, Linda was in their bedroom. She had a small lamp on. She changed into her own pajamas and crawled under the covers. Once Jack was settled in beside her, she reached over and turned off the light, and the room went dark. Soon, they were both fast asleep. But several hours later, in the middle of the night, Linda was jolted awake by a horribly loud noise. She shot up in bed, her heart pounding. She looked around the dark room, trying to figure out what had happened. When her eyes finally adjusted to the darkness, she saw something that made her gasp. The next morning, at a church just a mile away from Linda and Jack's house, a preschool teacher was getting her classroom ready for the day. As the children started to arrive, she noticed there was one empty chair. One of her students, 4-year-old Damien Huffman, was late. This wasn't totally unusual. She knew Damien's great-grandparents were busy people. They ran a farm, a pizza shop, and a car restoration business. She figured they were probably just running a little behind schedule. So she started the class as usual, hoping they would drop Damien off before he missed too much of the day. About an hour later, around 9:30 in the morning, she was leading the class in their morning sing-alongs. Suddenly, the classroom door burst open and Damien came sprinting inside. At first, the teacher was just relieved to see him. But then she got a closer look. Damien looked frazzled and he was out of breath. He wasn't wearing his backpack. He was still in his pajamas. And there was a smear of something dark and brown on the front of his shirt. She immediately ran over to him and knelt down. As she got closer, she realized the brown spot on his shirt was dried blood. The teacher's heart sank. She gently asked Damien what was going on. He looked up at her with a scared and confused expression on his little face. He told her that his great-grandparents' faces were melting. About 15 minutes after that, a police sergeant named Mark Whitaker and his partner were driving their patrol car down a secluded road toward a farmhouse in rural Ohio. Sergeant Whitaker had been a detective with the Darker County Sheriff's Department for 5 years, and he was the head of the investigative unit. When the department got a very strange 911 call that morning from a local preschool, he was the one sent out to see what was going on. The preschool teacher on the phone had sounded frantic. She said a 4-year-old student named Damien Huffman had shown up for school alone, covered in what looked like blood, and was saying something bizarre about his great-grandparents' faces melting. The teacher gave the police the names of the great-grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, and their address. Whitaker had no idea what a 4-year-old boy could have meant by that strange phrase, or what kind of scene he and his partner were about to walk into, but he had a very bad feeling about it. They pulled up to the farm and parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. When Whitaker got out of his car, the first thing he noticed was how eerily quiet it was. There was another farmhouse just across the road and a few more scattered on the horizon, but otherwise they were surrounded by nothing but empty fields. It felt completely isolated. Whitaker started walking towards the front of the farmhouse. As he got closer, he saw that the front door was already wide open. He didn't see any obvious signs of a forced entry, like a kicked-in door or a broken lock, but it was still unsettling. Whitaker and his partner reflexively drew their weapons. They stepped carefully over the threshold and into the house. Whitaker called out, announcing their presence, asking if anyone was home. But there was no response. The only sound was the wind whistling through the open door. From where he was standing in the entryway, he could see another open door across the room. It led to a set of stairs going down, probably to a basement. Whitaker decided to ignore the basement for now and focus on clearing the main floor first. He and his partner moved cautiously through the house. They went into the kitchen. It was empty. Once they were sure it was clear, they continued down a hallway until they found a doorway that led into a bedroom. Whitaker pushed the door open and stepped inside. And that's when he found them. Damien's great-grandparents, Jack and Linda Myers, were lying in their bed side by side. It was obvious from the moment he saw them that they were both dead. Jack was lying on his stomach. Whitaker could immediately see a large dark wound on the back of Jack's neck. It looked like a bullet wound. Linda was lying on her back. She had gunshot wounds on her face and on her hand, as if she had raised her hand in a last desperate attempt to defend herself just before she was shot. At this point, Whitaker and his partner did a full, systematic search of the rest of the house just to make sure the killer wasn't still hiding somewhere inside. The house was empty. So the two of them returned to the master bedroom to begin the difficult task of processing the crime scene. Whitaker pulled on a pair of latex gloves and gently touched the wound on Linda's face. The blood was still warm and wet to the touch. Based on that, he figured they had likely only been dead for a few hours at most. He scanned the floor around the bed, looking for bullet casings. He couldn't find any. This told him something important. It meant the killer had been careful. They had taken the time to pick up the spent casings afterwards to cover their track. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was planned. Then, Whitaker's partner called his attention to something strange. There was a weird, plasticky bundle lying on a pillow near Jack's head. Whitaker carefully picked it up. It was a piece of quilting fabric that had been wadded up into a ball and then covered in layers of masking tape. He turned it over in his gloved hands. His best guess was that it was a homemade gun silencer. The killer had probably taped it to the end of their gun to try and muffle the sound of the gunshots. It must have been blown off when they started firing. This immediately raised a question in Whitaker's mind. If this was a silencer, why would a killer even need one? They were out here in the middle of nowhere. The nearest neighbors were far away, but then he remembered who else was in the house. He left the bedroom and went up a flight of stairs. The room directly above where the murders had taken place was another bedroom. This one was filled with stuffed animals and toy trucks. It was obviously Damien's room. And that's when it clicked for Whitaker. The killer must have known there was a toddler sleeping right upstairs. They needed the silencer because they didn't want to wake the child when they committed the murders. And this meant one thing for sure. The killer almost certainly knew Jack and Linda personally. This wasn't a random home invasion. This was personal. Within minutes, more officers from the Darke County Sheriff's Office arrived and began to swarm the property. Whitaker went back outside to supervise them as they set up a perimeter and started their search for evidence. Pretty quickly, a forensics officer called him over. They had found a set of footprints in the soft mud near the side of the house. Whitaker followed the trail of footprints, which led them around the side of the house to a small basement window. The window pane had been carefully pried off, leaving an open hole just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Whitaker crouched down and peered through the opening. Inside, he could see a set of stairs leading up to the main floor of the house. This had to be how the killer got inside. It also explained why that basement door had been standing wide open when they first entered the house. This discovery only made Whitaker more certain that the killer was someone close to the family. They obviously knew the layout of the house. Whitaker told the forensics officer to make a plaster cast of the footprints. With any luck, it would tell them the type and size of shoe the killer was wearing. As Whitaker stood back up, he noticed something else. The phone lines that ran along the side of the house had been cut. The wire was cleanly severed. The killer had planned this meticulously. They had made sure that no one inside the house would be able to call for help. Just then, a pickup truck pulled up at the end of the road. A woman got out and started walking hesitantly toward the house. Whitaker quickly walked over to intercept her, making sure she didn't get too close and contaminate the crime scene. He asked her what she needed. She explained that she was a neighbor who lived at the next property over. She said she had seen all the police cars and didn't know what was going on, but she thought she had some information that might be helpful. The neighbor told Whitaker that around 4:30 that morning, she had been awake and had seen a minivan leaving the Myers farm. It had been too dark for her to see the color of the minivan, but the vehicle itself had stuck out in her memory. As far as she knew, the Myers family did not own a minivan. Hearing this, Whitaker realized this woman may have seen the killer leaving the property. If that was true, it meant the murders most likely happened sometime before 4:30 in the morning. This was a potentially huge piece of the puzzle. He thanked the neighbor for her help. After she left, Whitaker went back inside the house to look for more clues. He really wanted to figure out a motive. He was convinced that whoever did this knew Jack and Linda, but that didn't explain why. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Was it revenge for some old grudge? He didn't know. As he walked through the house, he found that deposit bag full of cash that Linda had brought home. It was sitting in plain sight in the living room. It hadn't been touched. There were also some expensive electronics in the living room, a TV, and a stereo system that were also untouched. This pretty much ruled out robbery as a motive. So Whitaker went back upstairs to take another closer look at the toddler's bedroom. As he scanned the room, he noticed something odd. On the child's bedding, there was a small reddish-brown stain. It looked like a spot of dried blood. While forensics teams were still carefully combing over every inch of the farmhouse, another investigator on the case, a man named Detective Mike Burns, drove to the local preschool. His task was to speak with the only potential witness, 4-year-old Damien. Burns was a father himself, and he felt an immediate wave of sympathy for this little boy who was sitting in a small office looking scared and utterly confused. He knew it was going to be incredibly difficult for Damien to talk about something so traumatic, but he was their best hope of figuring out what had happened to his great-grandparents. Burns sat down on the floor with Damien in a private room. He spoke in a soft, calm voice and asked the little boy to try and explain what had happened that morning. Damien, in the simple way that a 4-year-old talks, said he had woken up around 8:45. The house was very, very quiet. So, he got out of his bed and went into his great-grandparents' bedroom. He said they were both in their bed, and at first, he just thought they were sleeping. But when he tried to wake them up, they wouldn't move. Then, he saw that there was blood on their faces. He said he tried to wipe the blood off with some Kleenex wipes, but there was just so much of it. He realized then that something was very, very wrong. He said he thought for a moment that their faces were melting. And so, thinking he needed to get help for them, he had run the entire mile down the road to his preschool. Burns was amazed that a child so young could remember and articulate so much about such a horrifying experience. He was also grateful. The boy's story explained why there was blood on his pajama shirt. But it still didn't explain the small spot of blood they'd found on Damien's own bed. So, Burns asked Damien if he had gone back into his own room at any point after finding his great-grandparents. But Damien shook his head and said no. He said he went straight out the front door and ran to his school. Burns felt like there had to be more to the story. He just couldn't explain how that bloodstain got onto Damien's bed. So, he brought over a dollhouse and some small toy figures. He asked Damien if he could act out everything that had happened the night before, using the toys to represent himself and his great-grandparents. Damien took the toy that represented himself and put it into a bed in one of the dollhouse rooms. Then he put the Jack and Linda toys into the bed in the other room. He said that everybody went to sleep at their normal bedtime. But then, he said, later, in the middle of the night, he heard his bedroom door open. He said somebody came inside. Burns asked Damien who it was. Damien paused for a long moment, and then he said, "The Green Monster." At first, Burns wasn't sure what to make of this. He wondered if Damien was just describing a nightmare or if his imagination was running wild. But then, Damien put the toys down. To represent the Green Monster, he used his fingers, and he made them crawl across the floor of the dollhouse, moving slowly toward his own bed. Damien explained that he had heard the door to his room open, and he had opened his eyes just a tiny bit. He didn't want whoever it was to know he was awake, so he was just squinting. And when he did that, he saw the Green Monster standing right next to his bed, and the Green Monster was pointing a gun at him. Damien said he was so scared that he squeezed his eyes shut as tight as he could and just pretended to be asleep. And then, when he finally dared to open his eyes again, the Green Monster was gone. After hearing this, Burns realized that Damien's memory was almost certainly not a dream. It was all too real. More than likely, Damien had come face to face with the person who killed his great-grandparents. They were the Green Monster. After leaving the preschool, the next priority for Detective Burns was to speak to Damien's mother, a 19-year-old named Amber Holscher. So, the detective drove out to Amber's house in a nearby town. When he rang the doorbell, she answered right away. At this point, no one in the family had been officially notified about the murders, so Amber had no idea why a detective was suddenly standing on her doorstep. Burns knew this would be difficult, so he gently asked if he could come inside to speak with her. Confused, Amber said, "Okay," and let him in. They sat down in her living room. Then Burns told her as gently as he could that her grandparents, Linda and Jack Myers, were no longer with them. When Amber heard this, she just looked confused. She asked what he meant. "Where are they?" she asked. Burns took a deep breath and had to clarify that they were deceased. Amber looked completely shocked. Her eyes filled with tears, and the first thing she asked was, "Is Damien dead too?" But Burns quickly reassured her. He told her that Damien was alive and safe, but that he was going to be kept in protective custody for a while. They were worried that whoever killed Jack and Linda might try to hurt Damien too. And until they had a suspect, Damien would not be allowed to see anyone in the family, including her, his own mother. At this point, Amber just broke down and started to cry. Burns felt terrible for her, but his main focus was on Damien. He knew he had to solve this case as quickly as possible. Every day that went by was another day that Damien would have to spend alone without any family to comfort him. Based on Amber's genuine shock and her immediate concern for her son, Burns felt it was highly unlikely that she was involved. Damien also hadn't mentioned seeing his mother at the farmhouse, but she might know something that could help them. Once she had calmed down a bit, Burns asked her if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt her grandparents. Right away, she nodded. She mentioned Damien's father, Andrew Huffman. She said Andrew hated Linda because Linda wouldn't let him see Damien. In fact, she said, just recently, Andrew had shown up at Linda's pizza shop and had started a big fight with her about custody. The argument had gotten so heated that Andrew had publicly threatened to kill Linda. This immediately caught Burns's attention. It provided a clear and powerful motive. If Linda and Jack were out of the way, Andrew would have a much easier time getting custody of Damien, so he thanked Amber for her help and promised he would be in touch soon. The moment he got back to his car, he called Sergeant Whitaker and told him what he had learned. Later that day, Whitaker and his partner made the 2-hour drive to Andrew's address in Newport, Kentucky. When they got there, Andrew came to the door and let them inside. He sat down and looked at them, waiting for them to explain why they were there. They told him that Linda and Jack had been murdered, and they watched his reaction very closely. He seemed surprised, but he definitely did not seem upset or sad. Andrew openly admitted that he did not get along with Amber's family. And when Whitaker asked him about the big argument at the pizza shop, Andrew didn't deny it. He admitted that he had, in fact, threatened to kill Linda. But he swore he would never actually do something like that. He said it was just an empty threat made in the heat of the moment. Still, Whitaker thought Andrew seemed very suspicious. So, he asked him for an alibi for the night of the murders. Andrew said he had stayed over at a girl's house that night. In the morning, he had stopped by his dad's house, and then he had gone straight to work. He told them they could ask all of those people, and they would all confirm his story. Whitaker wrote all of this down. He asked Andrew a few more questions, and then thanked him for his time. As soon as the detectives left Andrew's house, they immediately went to go check on his alibi. They drove to the girlfriend's house. Then they went to Andrew's dad's house. And finally, they went to his place of work. And every single person at all three locations confirmed Andrew's story. His alibi was solid. Unless all of them were lying, there was simply no window of time where Andrew could have driven 2 hours to Ohio, murdered Jack and Linda, and then driven back. Whitaker was disappointed. They had basically wasted most of the day chasing a lead that now looked like a dead end. And he was very aware that every moment this case went unsolved was another moment that little Damien had to spend all alone away from his family. The following morning, Detective Burns, the same officer who had spoken to Damien and his mother, was sitting in his office feeling very frustrated. He had one main goal for the day. He wanted to find and interview Jack's estranged son, 28-year-old Travis Myers. But it was proving to be much harder than he had anticipated. The day before, other sheriff's deputies had interviewed Linda and Jack's family and friends. Several family members had mentioned that Travis and his father Jack had some very bad blood between them. When Burns had looked into Travis's background, he found that Travis also had a criminal record. But there was a big problem. It seemed like Travis hadn't even been in the state of Ohio for the last 7 years. The last anyone in the family had heard, he had moved to Arizona to live with his mother. But when Burns had called the mother that morning, she said that she actually had no idea where Travis was. There was no other address on record for him. So, Burns basically had no way of finding him. He decided his best bet was to start by visiting Travis's younger brother, Greg. Burns knew Greg lived only a few towns over, and even though he wasn't sure how close the two brothers were, it was the only lead he had. A little while later, Burns showed up at Greg's house and knocked on the front door. A moment later, a young man in a baseball cap opened the door. It was clear from his red, swollen eyes that he had been crying. Burns asked if he was Greg Myers. The young man nodded and stepped aside to let him in. Greg didn't seem surprised by the visit at all. He said the police had already called him the night before to tell him about his father and stepmother's murders. He said that since then, he'd just been waiting for an officer to come by and talk to him. He said he'd seen enough TV shows to know that family members were always the first suspects. But as they walked into the living room, Burns stopped in his tracks. There was another young man standing in the doorway, and he looked a lot like Greg. Burns asked who it was. Greg said, "Oh, that's my brother Travis." Burns couldn't believe his luck. He had come here hoping to maybe get a lead on where Travis might be. He never imagined he would just find Travis standing right there in Greg's house. This was a huge development. Until this moment, Burns had no idea if Travis was even in the state at the time of the murders. But Greg explained that Travis had actually been in Ohio for the past several weeks. He had been staying in an apartment he had rented nearby. Burns thought the timing of this seemed incredibly suspicious. It was just too convenient that Travis had come back to town for the first time in almost a decade, right before his estranged father and stepmother were killed. It just seemed too perfect. And something about the scene just felt off. The two brothers just standing there waiting for the police to come and question them. It didn't sit right with him. So Burns, acting on a gut instinct, told them both that he needed to question them formally. He said they would have to come with him down to the station. Less than an hour later, Detective Burns led Greg and Travis Myers into the Darke County Sheriff's Office. Neither of the brothers was under arrest yet, but Burns had a strong feeling that by the end of their interviews, one or both of them might be. Burns took Greg into his office for questioning, while his partner took Travis into an interview room down the hall. As soon as Greg sat down, Burns noticed that he wasn't making any eye contact. He was fidgeting and acting shifty. But Greg quickly said that he was perfectly willing to tell the detectives anything they wanted to know if it could help them solve his dad and stepmother's murders. So Burns began asking questions. He asked Greg where he was in the early hours of Thursday morning when Jack and Linda were killed. Greg told him that he was mostly just asleep. That is, until about 4:30, when he got up to go to his job at a factory a few towns over. He also said his girlfriend was at home with him the entire night, and she could confirm that. He then said he drove to work in his minivan. He clocked in at 5:23 in the morning, and he even had a signed time card at home that would prove it. Burns was immediately very interested to learn that Greg drove a minivan. Remember, the neighbor had said she saw a minivan leaving the Myers farm around 4:30 that morning, suggesting the killer drove a minivan. However, Burns was starting to realize that even if Greg's alibi was a little shaky, the timing alone seemed to rule him out. It seemed basically impossible to drive from Greg's house at 4:30, go all the way to the farm, commit the murders, then drive all the way to the factory, and still be able to clock in by 5:23. There just didn't seem to be enough time to do all of that. Also, pretty much everyone in the family had told Burns that Greg was actually quite close with Jack and Linda. Yes, he was having some problems with drugs and alcohol, but he had no history of crime or violence, and none of his family members thought he seemed capable of being a killer. So, even though Greg was still technically a suspect, Burns decided to shift his focus to Travis. Burns asked Greg how Travis had reacted when he heard about the murders. Greg said Travis had been upset, but he had mostly been concerned about how Greg was coping, since Greg was the one who was much closer to Jack and Linda. Greg went on to say that it had been at least 7 years since Travis and his father had spoken. He said those two did not get along at all. Burns asked Greg about that big falling out between Jack and Travis. Greg said it all came down to business disagreements on the farm. He said Travis had felt like his father was cheating him out of money. They had a huge argument that got really ugly. After that, Travis had just quit the family business and moved away. Burns thought about this. He wondered if maybe Travis stood to inherit any money if his father died. Because if he did, that would certainly be a solid motive for murder. So, Burns made 2 mental notes. First, check into Greg's alibi more thoroughly. And second, look into Jack's will to see how his assets were supposed to be divided up. After that, he thanked Greg for his cooperation, told him to wait in his office, and then Burns left. He went right down the hall and waited outside the room where his partner was questioning Travis. Later, Burns's partner told him that Travis had seemed really nervous from the moment he stepped into the room. The detective had asked him what he was doing back in Ohio. Travis said he'd just been reevaluating his life recently and realized he had never actually met his brother Greg's children. So, he'd come back to Ohio to do just that and spend some time with them. Then, the detective asked him what he was doing at the time Jack and Linda were killed. Travis stuttered and said he was sleeping in his apartment. The detective asked if he had anyone who could confirm that. Travis hesitated for a moment and then shook his head and said no. Then the detective asked Travis if he had a car. Travis said that at the moment he was driving his mother's car. It was a white minivan. After getting the summary from his partner, Burns went back to his office. By this point, Greg had been moved to a different room. Burns sat down at his desk and began going over the evidence they had collected so far. The investigation had been moving very quickly, so there actually wasn't a whole lot of physical evidence processed yet. It had only been 24 hours since the forensic evidence had been sent to the crime lab, so they were still waiting for results on just about everything. Burns knew that at this point, the best thing he could do while he waited was to follow up on Travis and Greg's alibis. They were the victim's sons, he already believed the killer was close to the family, and they both drove minivans. Really, either of them could be the killer. But just then, Burns's office phone rang. He picked it up. It was a local man who said he had seen a news report about the murders of Jack and Linda Myers. And he had some information that he thought might help. The man said that a few days earlier, a friend of his had called him to ask if he knew where they could buy a gun. And when this man asked his friend why he needed a gun, the friend said it was because he, quote, wanted to shoot Jack Myers. The man on the phone told Burns the name of his friend who had said this, and as soon as Burns heard that name, he knew exactly who the murderer was. Based on that crucial phone call, as well as the forensic evidence from the crime scene, this is what police believe happened to Jack and Linda Myers on the morning of the 27th of March 2003. Early that morning, the killer woke up, got out of bed, and immediately put on a green hunting jumpsuit. They also packed a bag with duct tape, trash bags, and a roll of masking tape. Then they put on a pair of latex gloves and loaded the 12-gauge shotgun they had purchased from a classified ad just 2 days earlier. They carried all of their supplies out to their minivan. After they were ready, they hopped into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove a familiar route through the dark, open fields of the countryside. They were calm at first, but as they turned onto the long gravel road that led to Jack and Linda's farm, their heart began to race. The killer felt like they had planned everything out perfectly and had prepared for anything that could possibly go wrong. So now, all they had to do was control their nerves and stick to the plan. The killer parked right outside the farmhouse. Then, while still sitting in the car, they climbed into the backseat of the minivan and grabbed their shotgun. They took a piece of thick quilting fabric, wrapped it around the barrel of the shotgun, and used masking tape to secure it in place. This was their do-it-yourself silencer. But as they did this, the killer's hands were shaking. They were nervous. As much as they had planned for this moment, it really wasn't something they wanted to do. But they felt like they had to. After their gun had its silencer, they slung it over their shoulder. They got out of the van and crept around to the side of the house. Once they were there, they cut the phone lines, making sure nobody inside could call for help. Then they knelt down in the dirt, pried open the basement window, and climbed inside. Once inside the dark basement, the killer walked to the stairs. They went up to the first floor and walked straight to the bedroom where they knew Jack and Linda would be asleep. They went inside. There they were, sleeping in their bed. The killer took a deep breath and then raised the shotgun. They fired a single round into the back of Jack's neck. But the force of the gunshot was too strong for the homemade silencer. It blew right off. So the shot wasn't silent at all. It was extremely loud. The silencer landed on the pillow right next to Jack's head. From the chaos, Linda sat bolt upright in bed. She looked straight at the killer and saw what was happening. She instinctively raised a hand to try and defend herself. In a moment of sheer panic, the killer just turned the shotgun on her. They fired twice. One blast went through her hand. The other struck her right in the face. At this point, the killer just paused and listened. The silencer had sort of muffled the first shot, but the next two were incredibly loud. They knew that noise easily could have woken up the third person they knew was in the house. A person they really didn't want to hurt. But if they had to, they would. So, just to make sure there were no loose ends, they left Linda in Jack's bedroom, confident they were dead, and they crept upstairs to little Damien's room. They went inside, carefully walked over to the boy's bed, raised their shotgun, and aimed it at the child, waiting to see if he was awake. But the little boy appeared to be sound asleep. And so, the killer spared him. They lowered their shotgun and backed out of the room. Once they were back in the hallway, they shut Damien's door and hurried right out of the house. From there, they got back in their minivan and sped off into the darkness. A few miles away, they stopped on a bridge and tossed their gun, their supplies, and their bloody clothes into a river. Then they changed into their work clothes and drove to the factory, where they clocked in at precisely 5:23 in the morning. The killer was Jack's younger son, Greg Myers. Greg had been having serious problems with money and drug abuse. His father, Jack, had refused to bail him out, and they had been fighting about it. Greg knew that he would inherit the farm if his father died. And he was so desperate, he decided that murder was his only option. When police timed the drive from Jack and Linda's farm to Greg's workplace, they found that he would have had just enough time to commit the horrible double murder and then drive straight to work and clock in by 5:23. His alibi was just barely possible. Greg was arrested about 48 hours after the crime. The investigation moved so quickly that police were still gathering evidence to use against him even after he was in custody. They later found the shotgun, the other supplies, and a pair of shoes that matched the prints found in the mud outside the house, all in a river right near the farm. Fingerprints and store receipts tied all of the items back to Greg. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Damien, following the murders, he went to live with his mother, Amber. Despite everything he witnessed at just 4 years old, Amber said in a 2021 documentary that he is now grown up and doing very well. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. Something strange is happening in North American national parks. Each year, hundreds of people disappear in these parks. These parks are huge, beautiful, and wild, so it's not uncommon for people to get lost. Take a wrong turn, trip over a route, or wander off a trail and get lost easily. However, a few cases stand out each year among the hundreds of disappearances. These people disappear in the most bizarre circumstances. Their disappearance is puzzling. You may have someone standing feet from their friends or family. Someone will watch them, turn around for a moment, and then disappear. No sound, struggle, or trace remains. They become invisible and never return. In other cases, professional rescue teams, trackers, and dogs will search extensively for a missing person. Nothing will be found. Days, weeks, or months later, that missing person is found miles and miles away, sometimes in rugged, steep areas that even an experienced climber cannot reach. Former police detective David Paulides noticed these strange patterns. He investigated these strange disappearances in national and state parks. The story began when a park ranger approached him. This ranger knew Paulides was a former detective with extensive investigation experience. The ranger informed him that the government and Park Service were closely monitoring strange events in state and national parks. He advised Paulides to investigate due to his investigative background. After investigating, he found many oddities and strange coincidences surrounding these disappearances. He found huge similarities between decades-old cases thousands of miles apart. He realized these were not random accidents. There was a pattern. He spent over 10,000 hours researching these strange cases. Missing 411 is the title of his 4 books. Searching that name online will reveal a wealth of information and discussions about these cases. He has 2 documentaries on the topic. David Paulides doesn't say what's causing these disappearances. No one claims to know the answer. Those who follow his research and read about these cases usually reach the same chilling conclusion. It seems like something is hunting people in North American national parks. It fascinates and terrifies. Today, we'll examine 5 of Missing 411's most bizarre and inexplicable cases. Our first story takes us back to Father's Day weekend in June 1969. A 6-year-old boy named Dennis Martin, his older brother, father, and grandfather went camping in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This was their family custom. Every Father's Day, the Martin boys and men went to the mountains to bond and enjoy the wilderness. All were eager for the trip. They hiked to the same campsite as years before. They knew it well and felt safe there. They pitched their tents, lit a campfire, and enjoyed their first night under the stars. The family enjoyed their afternoon the next day in the beautiful weather. While passing by their campsite, another camper saw Dennis and his brother playing. The Martin boys' age was similar to this camper's kids. The camper stopped and asked Dennis's father if his kids could play. He thought kids could run and play together. Dennis's father was fine with that and told him to bring them over. Soon, all the kids were running, playing, and laughing at the campsite. They decided to play hide and seek. Sitting nearby, parents and grandparents chatted and watched the kids. Dennis's father later said he always watched him. He kept an eye on his son from afar to prevent him from getting into the thick brush. All the kids ran to hide from the parents. Dennis's father watched his 6-year-old son walk behind a large tree nearby. He saw him wait behind the trunk. A few moments later, the parents called out to the kids that the game was over and they should show themselves. All the kids ran out of the woods laughing and shouting except Dennis. Dennis's father initially didn't care. He had seen his son hide behind that tree, so he knew where he was. He thought Dennis was being mischievous and wanted to win by hiding. Dennis was called out of hiding by his father. Nobody responded. The father smiled, shook his head, and walked to the tree, calling his son again. He anticipated seeing his little boy giggling behind the trunk and jumping out to scare him. His heart sank when the father stepped behind the tree. Dennis was absent. Nothing was behind the trunk. The father panicked. He ran into the woods, yelling his son's name. He frantically pushed through bushes and branches. He ran nearly 2 miles up the nearby Appalachian Trail, hollering for Dennis, but only heard his own voice in the trees. While the family dispersed, they searched the campsite. They believed the boy could not have gone far. He had just stood there a minute earlier. The father repeated that he saw his son walk behind that tree. He knew he hadn't looked away. He knew his son was nearby. But Dennis was gone. When the family couldn't find him, they called the park rangers, who launched a massive search and rescue operation. This was the largest Great Smoky Mountains National Park search ever. Over 1,500 searchers participated, not just local volunteers and forest rangers. The U.S. Army Green Berets, some of the world's most elite Special Forces soldiers, were called in to help with the urgent and high-profile search. Helicopters buzzed overhead, and tracking dogs found scents. Across 60 square miles of rugged mountain terrain, the searchers meticulously searched. Under every rock, cave, and ravine, they searched. Nothing was found. Nothing was found of Dennis. No scent was detected by the tracking dogs. There were no footprints, torn clothes, or dropped items. Dennis Martin seemed to vanish when he stepped behind that tree. The investigators were completely confused. They questioned Dennis's father again. Explaining what he saw was requested. They told him his story was illogical. How could he have vanished without being seen or heard if he was watching the tree and the boy was there? Since he saw what he saw, the father stuck to his story. The massive search found nothing, leaving the family without answers or closure. Dennis disappeared, and they never knew why. When researching his Missing 411 books, David Paulides dug into the Dennis Martin case years later. He interviewed other families who were at the campground on Dennis's disappearance day. He wanted to know if anyone else noticed anything odd. The Key family was found by him. They camped there over the weekend. The Key father told Paulides a fascinating and disturbing story. He said his family asked a park ranger where they could see wild bears the afternoon Dennis disappeared. The ranger directed them to a remote park area. After hiking there, the Key family looked around. One of their children heard a terrifying mountainside scream. The family turned when the child pointed to the noise. They could see a steep ravine slope from their vantage point. They could see, between the sparse mountainside trees, the father saw a large, hairy bear hurrying up the mountain. As he watched, he noticed something was wrong. Something big was over its shoulder. The father said this creature was moving differently from a bear. It ran fast and agile on two legs, dodging trees like a human athlete. It was hairy and wild like an animal, but it moved and posed like a human. The object over its shoulder resembled a child. The Key family immediately informed Dennis Martin researchers of this unusual sighting. However, investigators ignored them. They thought the family was seeking attention or had gone crazy after hearing about the missing boy. The sighting was not recorded in the case file. It was ignored until David Paulides found it decades later. The Key family saw this strange bear man carrying a child about an hour after Dennis Martin disappeared in the same park area. The whole story is haunted by this detail. Next, our second case takes us to Ritter, Oregon in spring 1952. Keith Parkins, too, was happy and active. He visited his grandfather's ranch in a remote wilderness area. Keith was playing in the yard with his older siblings this day. While adults prepared lunch in the ranch house, the kids ran around enjoying the fresh air. The spring was freezing, so the weather was cold. The ground was still covered in snow, and temperatures were well below zero. Keith was unprepared for the extreme cold. He was wearing light clothing, not winter gear for sub-zero temperatures. When lunch was ready, the grandfather invited the kids inside. The older siblings ran into the house, but Keith did not. His family realized he was missing immediately. They quickly searched the ranch area outside. They called his name and checked barns, outbuildings, stables, and fields. He was missing, so they needed help. The local sheriff was contacted, and a full search and rescue operation began. Volunteers, police, and trackers searched the snowy wilderness around the ranch after community support. After hours, the sun set, lowering the temperature even more. Seekers were desperate. They knew a 2-year-old without winter gear would die in sub-zero temperatures. Trackers found tiny snow footprints after several hours of searching. They lived 4 miles from the grandfather's ranch. Stunned searchers. They couldn't believe a 2-year-old boy could walk 4 miles alone through deep snow and rugged terrain. But toddler footprints were obvious. They followed the footprints in the wilderness. The tracks wound through trees and over rough ground for miles. The footprints stopped abruptly. Without snow tracks, the boy's whereabouts were unknown. Due to darkness and extreme cold, the searchers had to stop, but they resumed the next morning. Keith was found the next day, 20 hours after he disappeared. He lived a staggering 12 miles from his grandfather's ranch. The searchers were shocked and amazed to find Keith alive. He lay face down in the snow. He was alive and conscious despite being very cold. His clothing was even stranger. His jacket and hat were neatly stacked next to his body after being removed. He was mostly unharmed except for deep red facial scratch marks. Searchers rushed him to medical attention with warm blankets. When adults and investigators asked the little boy what happened and how he got so far away, he was too young to explain. At 2 years old, he couldn't tell a complex story. He only said that a cat scratched him, repeating it over and over. He said a cat scratched him and said nothing else. In 20 hours, a 2-year-old toddler traveled 12 miles through deep snow and rugged wilderness. nobody understood how. It made no sense. The famous outdoorsman and Survivorman star Les Stroud heard about this case years later. He was so curious and skeptical that he went to the area to recreate the journey. He wondered if he could cover 12 miles in 20 hours under those conditions. A fit adult, Stroud has decades of survival training. He tried to hike the route but ran out of time. He said on camera that a 2-year-old child could not have walked that far in the freezing cold and deep snow, let alone survived. But Keith Parkins did. Keith was interviewed about his childhood disappearance decades later. He admitted to having no memory of the event. He has no idea how he got there, what happened, or why he said a cat scratched him. One of the most puzzling survival stories ever. Our third case covers 1973's end. Michigan-born amateur photographer Charles McCullough, 19, decided to tour the West Coast. He wanted to visit all the region's beautiful national parks to photograph the landscapes. He was creative and artistic, but he had little outdoor survival experience. He lived in a run-down Volkswagen van while traveling. Charles reached Oregon in January 1974. He wanted to visit Crater Lake National Park. He wanted to photograph Crater Lake in winter after hearing about its beauty. He arrived in the area and realized his old Volkswagen van would not survive. His van lacked the power and traction to navigate the snowy roads to Crater Lake. Charles contacted a local friend to keep his dream alive. This friend had a snow-ready all-terrain vehicle. Charles asked his friend to drive him to Crater Lake to take pictures. Our friend agreed, and they headed into the snowy wilderness. Charles joked to his friend while driving. He laughed and suggested filing a missing person report if he hadn't heard from him in 2 days. The friend laughed along, thinking it was a joke about Charles's outdoor incompetence. Charles left with his camera gear after his friend dropped him off near the lake. After several days, Charles did not return. He didn't check in or show up at his van. His friend remembered the joke, but he realized it was serious. He followed through on his promise and reported missing people to the police. Police and park rangers immediately searched Crater Lake extensively. They searched with helicopters, snowmobiles, and search teams. But the weather was terrible. The search area was covered in 5 to 7 feet of snow from a massive winter storm. Charles was nowhere to be found. There were no footprints, abandoned gear, or clues. Charles's father flew from Michigan to Oregon in desperation to find him. He rented a cabin and lived there for months, searching the snowy woods alone every day for his boy. He found nothing. Charles was presumed dead after the search was called off. 1 year later, a couple of backpackers hiked the rugged Crater Lake area. As novice hikers, they took a wrong turn. They got lost in the thick woods far from the trailhead. They found an old weathered backpack on the ground while trying to get back. They searched the backpack for identification to return it. A peculiar key was inside. The key was unique for an older Volkswagen. The hikers returned to safety and gave the police the backpack and key. Investigators immediately recognized the Volkswagen key's significance. They confirmed this was Charles McCullough's backpack with his family. The case had its first break in over a year. The police quickly formed a search team and went to the backpack's location. 12 miles from the trailheads was this spot. It was a deep, isolated forest area that was hard to reach in winter. After searching the backpack area, investigators found gruesome and unusual items. A pair of pants was found near the backpack. Unbuttoned pants lay on a log. One person appeared to have sat on the log, unbuttoned their pants, and then disappeared into the ground. Socks protruded from the pants. Investigators found Charles's foot bones in the socks. There were no shoes. No jacket or upper skeleton was near the pants. The rest of him was gone. The investigators searched the area and found a piece of Charles's skull on the forest floor 12 feet from the pants. They found nothing more of Charles McCullough. Authorities determined that Charles died of natural causes, likely from exposure to the cold, and that wild animals scavenged his body. His family refused to accept this explanation. Considering the physical evidence and circumstances, nothing makes sense. First, Charles lacked his heavy winter jacket and boots. Why would he remove his boots and jacket if he was dying, freezing? Second, his expensive photography gear was lost. Third, his head was detached from his body and his upper skeleton was missing, but his pants were neatly unbuttoned on a log and his feet bones were still in his socks. The most important discovery was his remains 12 miles from the trailhead. Charles disappeared amid 5 to 7 feet of snow. Charles was not an outdoorsman, and his friend said he was unprepared for winter. How could a young man without snowshoes wear light clothing and hike 12 miles through 7 feet of snow in the middle of nowhere before dying? Physically impossible. However, the case was closed as natural causes, leaving his family with endless questions. Our fourth case takes us to September 2004 inches, the Yukon Territory of Canada. Outdoor survival and hunting legend Bart Schleyer. He was no ordinary hunter. He was an expert outdoorsman known for his wilderness skills. He could survive and thrive in any environment on Earth. He spent months tracking and catching wild Siberian tigers for research in the freezing wilderness of Siberia, demonstrating his expertise. He was a world-renowned tiger tracker, stealth expert, and animal behavior and wilderness survival expert. He was tough and respected by his peers. Bart chartered a float plane to explore the Yukon in September 2004. He was dropped off in a remote wilderness 175 miles north of civilization by the pilot. Bart wanted to hunt moose alone for 3 weeks. His gear was top-notch, and he had plenty of supplies. He was in his element, and no one worried about his safety. Bart unloaded his gear and told the pilot to meet him at the same spot in 3 weeks after the float plane landed on a remote lake. The pilot wished Bart luck, took off, and left him in the vast Canadian wilderness. 3 weeks later, the pilot returned to the remote lake to retrieve Bart. After landing, he taxied the plane to shore, but Bart was not there. The pilot was unconcerned because Bart was a wilderness expert. He assumed Bart was late or packing. The pilot hiked a short distance to Bart's base camp. The campsite was intact when he arrived. The tent held Bart's belongings. It appeared someone was still living in the camp. There was food outside, and the campsite was clean. Nothing had disturbed or destroyed it. The pilot surveyed the area. A dry bag was lying next to a large tree near the main camp, near the woods. He noticed that the dry bag had a distinct physical indentation, as if it had been used as a seat for a long time. Bart's hunting bow and arrows were leaning against the tree trunk. It looked like a place an experienced hunter would sit quietly and call in a moose. Bart was not near the dry bag or bow and arrow. The pilot searched the tree's surroundings, and his heart sank. He found several Bart teeth on the forest floor near the dry bag and bough. He also found 2 small broken bone shards nearby. The pilot immediately called the authorities, who sent a search team to the remote area. The first obvious theory was that a grizzly bear or pack of wolves killed Bart while he was sitting by the tree. No other explanation made sense. However, Bart's friends and the scene investigators found several major flaws in this theory. First, Bart was a top tracker and apex predator expert. He spent his life studying tigers and bears. Friends said it was nearly impossible for a predator to sneak up on Bart. He was always aware of his surroundings and would have heard or sensed an animal approaching before it got close. Second, investigators found no death struggle. The fight between a human and a large predator is always fierce. A large area is covered in blood, broken branches, torn ground, and smashed bushes. This scene lacked that. Nothing was moved, the bushes were intact, and there was no fighting. It looked like Bart had vanished from his seat, leaving only his teeth and a few bone shards. The campsite was another issue. Food was outside at the campsite. If a grizzly bear attacked and ate a human, it would have smelled the campsite food. Bears are known for raiding camps and destroying tents for food. However, Bart's campsite was unspoiled. No animal had touched the food. The official investigation found that Bart was killed and eaten by a predator, but few who knew him or the wilderness believed it. The physical evidence and campsite circumstances were incomprehensible. This is our fifth and final case, set in 2002 inches, Harris County, Georgia. Professional land surveyor Christopher Tompkins was 20. Christopher was part of a 4-man survey crew today. Long stretches of land along a rural paved road were their responsibility. Dense woods and a barbed wire fence parallel to the road defined the properties. 4 men were walking along the road in a straight line, 50 feet apart. This was standard surveying practice. Christopher was last in line, trailing. The 3rd man in line ahead of him would later give police and investigators a detailed account. He said he tried to turn around and check on Christopher while walking and working. He always made sure no one was falling behind. Traffic was non-existent on the quiet road. The surveyor said he turned around, saw Christopher walking normally 50 feet behind him, and then continued working. The surveyor turned around to check on Christopher 1 minute later. His shock was complete when the road behind him was empty. Christopher left. There was no sound. No screams, shouts, struggles, or running into the brush were heard. Complete silence. Right away, the surveyor stopped and called for the other 2 crew members. They ran back down the road to where Christopher was walking a minute earlier. They called his name and searched the ground and woods, but found nothing. They found several unusual items on the ground as they looked closer. A neat pile of loose change was on the roadside dirt. Christopher always carried small work tools in his pockets next to the coins. Someone appeared to have flipped Christopher over and dumped his pockets on the ground. They then examined the roadside barbed wire fence. The fence's sharp barb held one of Christopher's heavy work boots. Christopher was missing, but the boot was tightly wedged onto the wire. The surveyors were appalled. They couldn't understand how their coworker disappeared in under 60 seconds without a sound. They immediately called the police, who launched a massive search and rescue operation. Searchers, tracking dogs, and helicopters searched miles of woods and fields around the road. Nothing was found. There were no footprints, clothing, or scent for the dogs. Christopher appeared to have been lifted off the ground and carried away. 9 months later, a search party searched a swampy, heavily wooded area about 900 yards from Christopher's disappearance road. The swamp's edge mud held Christopher's other work boot. That was all they found. No clothing, remains, or other clues were found. Discovery of the second boot was unclear. So the case became more confusing. No one knows what happened to Christopher Tompkins. The survey crew, especially the 3rd-in-line man, were cleared. They had no reason and could not have made Christopher disappear so quickly and silently without anyone noticing. The boot in the barbed wire fence and the pile of loose change remind us of his bizarre and terrifying disappearance. After reading all 5 stories, you understand why David Paulides has spent his life researching these cases. Too many details defy a rational narrative. How does a 6-year-old boy disappear behind a tree while his father watches? 2-year-old toddler survives 12 miles in the snow on a cold night. How does an unprepared teenager hike 12 miles in deep snow and end up with his pants unbuttoned on a log and his feet bones in his socks? How does a predator take an elite survivalist without a fight, leaving his camp untouched? How does a grown man get snatched off a road in seconds, leaving his pocket change and boot in a fence? Two schools of thought exist about missing 411. The first camp believes that every disappearance has a rational, scientific explanation, even if we don't know it. They claim that the wilderness is vast, unpredictable, and dangerous, and that human memory and perception are unreliable, especially in emergencies. They attribute these oddities to animal attacks, hypothermia, and human error. These cases, according to the second camp, indicate something more sinister and possibly paranormal. They believe a predator or force is hunting humans in North American national parks. Some think it's Bigfoot, others extraterrestrials, and others an unknown creature or phenomenon we don't understand. They claim that thousands of cases have too many similarities to be a coincidence. Whether these mysteries will ever be solved logically is unknown. However, these stories will haunt the families of the missing and fascinate those who seek the truth about the deep, dark woods until then. Consider the families left behind in all these cases. Father's Day was never celebrated again for the Martins. A day of mourning and painful remembering. A record-sized park search for Dennis ended in silence. The Key family's sighting of the strange creature carrying a child was never investigated, leaving the tragedy in limbo. Did the authorities miss the one clue it could have found Dennis? Was there something in those mountains they couldn't catch or understand? The mystery has lasted decades, leaving a family who wanted a weekend in the mountains without closure. Survival was a miracle for Keith Parkins, but it was shrouded in mystery. He grew up with a 20-hour memory gap from being lost in a freezing wilderness. The only clues to his fate are his face scratches and repeated cat words. How a 2-year-old survived sub-zero temperatures and traveled a distance an elite survival expert could not replicate defies physics. Keith may have been alone in those woods, or something may have kept him alive and carried him those 12 miles. The authorities gave Charles McCullough's family unsatisfactory answers after years of fighting. It's hard to accept that your son died naturally after being found 12 miles off trail in 7 feet of snow with his pants unbuttoned on a log and his feet bones in his socks. It seems like a simple explanation to close a case that was too bizarre and difficult to solve. The missing camera equipment, upper skeleton, and skull suggest a violent and strange death. The family wondered what happened to Charles in Crater Lake's beautiful, deadly woods. Bart Schleier's death shocked the outdoor community. He was unbeatable in the wilderness. He disappeared from his tree seat, leaving only his teeth and a few bone shards, a tragic and unbelievable ending for a legend. The quiet disappearance, lack of struggle, and untouched campsite disprove the wild animal attack theory. It suggests that whatever took Bart could bypass his decades of experience and stealth and take him so quickly and cleanly that he could not reach for his bow. Even the most experienced hunters and trackers shudder at the thought. Finally, Christopher Tompkins' disappearance shows how quickly life can be taken. His co-workers heard nothing from 50 feet away. The road debris, loose change, tools, and boot in the barbed wire paint a disturbing picture of a sudden vertical snatching. This kind of event shows how fragile our sense of security is, even with friends. The discovery of his second boot in a swamp 9 months later only made the nightmare worse, raising more questions. These 5 cases are just a small sample of the thousands of mysterious disappearances in our national parks. They are a powerful reminder that despite all our technology and modern comforts, there are still vast, wild places on Earth where we are not the top of the food chain and where nature does not apparently apply. Whether rational or paranormal, the wilderness is a place of deep mystery, and those who enter it must be cautious. In the woods, some will never leave because the trees may never reveal their secrets. To understand these disappearances' scale, one must understand their geographic and environmental contexts. These are not small city parks with paved paths and manicured lawns. Nature is wild and vast in these areas. Over 800 square miles of the Great Smoky Mountains are where Dennis Martin disappeared. It has steep ridges, deep valleys, and dense vegetation. Large rhododendron bushes, fallen logs, and thick leaves cover the forest floor. These tightly packed bushes form rhododendron hells, which are nearly impenetrable. One can stand 5 feet inside one of these patches and be invisible to the outside. A 6-year-old boy disappeared in seconds here. Massive, unprecedented search for Dennis Martin. When a child was reported missing, the community rallied. Hundreds of locals, hunters, and outdoorsmen helped within hours. They were joined by Park Service rangers, local police, and the Tennessee National Guard. As hours turned into days, the search became more complicated. The nearby U.S. Army Green Berets were called in by the federal government. These elite Special Forces soldiers know wilderness survival, tracking, and search. The military's large deployment for a missing child sparked many rumors and theories. Some suspected the search was for more than a lost boy. Why were combat-ready Special Forces soldiers searching a national park's woods? Even with massive manpower, the search was difficult. Weather in the Great Smoky Mountains is unpredictable. A massive mountain thunderstorm hit the night Dennis disappeared. Rain poured. Rainstorms dumped inches of water on mountain slopes. The rain caused creek flash flooding and muddied dirt trails. For the searchers, this was disaster. The heavy rain erased Dennis's footprints. It also hindered tracking dog work. Bloodhounds and search dogs use ground and air scent molecules. The rain washed away those molecules, confusing the dogs and making trail finding impossible. Searchers had to use visual tracking, which was nearly impossible in the dense brush. The Key family's sighting injected controversy into the case. Harold Key, his wife, and their children hiked to Rowan's Creek, several miles from Dennis's disappearance. A park ranger suggested the area for bear sightings, so they hoped to see one. The sound of a child screaming in terror interrupted their walk. Harold Key saw a large, hairy, dark figure running up a steep ridge across the ravine. The figure, Key later described, looked like a bear, but walked like a human on 2 legs. It appeared that the figure was carrying a small child in light-colored clothing. Key informed Dwight McCarter, a park ranger, when they returned to the main area. McCarter was an expert ranger who knew the park well. Information was mostly ignored as it was passed up the chain of command. The Dennis Martin investigators did not want to pursue a monster sighting lead. They wanted to find a lost child who had wandered off, and they thought a bear man theory would waste resources and make the search look ridiculous. Dennis Martin's connection to the sighting was never investigated. The public only realized the terrifying implications of what the Key family had witnessed decades later when David Paulides dug up the reports. Take Keith Parkins of Ritter, Oregon. Ritter, a tiny ranching community in Grant County, Oregon, is in the rugged high desert and canyon country. Sagebrush plains, steep canyons, and scattered pine forests dominate the landscape. This beautiful but harsh environment is especially harsh in spring. When 2-year-old Keith disappeared, the temperature was dropping rapidly and there was still a lot of snow. He was staying on a remote ranch with miles of rugged terrain. 2-year-olds are physically limited. That age toddlers walk shakily. They trip easily, tire easily, and fear darkness and solitude. It's hard to believe Keith walked 4 miles alone through deep snow and rocky terrain. What's amazing is that he was found 12 miles away, alive and unharmed, after 20 hours in sub-zero temperatures. An adult would have to walk nearly 1 mile per hour for 20 hours without resting, eating, or sleeping to cover 12 miles. This is physically impossible for a 2-year-old. The toddler would have had to climb steep canyon walls, cross freezing creeks, and push through dense sagebrush in the pitch-black night. The story is further complicated by Keith's clothing when found. Keith lay face down in a frozen area when the rancher found him. His little jacket and hat were neatly stacked on the ground next to him. Paradoxical undressing occurs in extreme hypothermia. After freezing, the brain misinterprets the extreme cold as burning heat, causing the victim to strip off to cool off. In delirium, paradoxical undressing causes the victim to scatter their clothes. It does not make a 2-year-old neatly stack their jacket and hat. Someone carefully removed and placed the clothes, judging by their neatness. Keith's face has scratch marks. His face was covered in deep red scratches when rescued. "A cat scratched me," the boy said when asked what happened. In Oregon's rural wilderness, cat can mean cougar or bobcat. These apex predators are skilled hunters and killers. A cougar would have grabbed Keith to hunt him. A cougar does not carry a child 12 miles through the woods, scratch his face, take his clothes, and leave him alive and face down in the snow. If animals were involved, it would have been tragic. That Keith survived and only remembered a cat raises an eerie, unanswered question about his disappearance. This case intrigued survival expert Les Stroud, who traveled to Ritter, Oregon to investigate. Woodcraft expert Stroud has survived in some of the harshest environments on Earth. He attempted the 12-mile hike from his grandfather's ranch to Keith's grave in similar weather. Stroud found the terrain brutal. Snow made every step exhausting, elevation changes were severe, and thick brush and barbed wire fences were constant obstacles. Stroud concluded that a 2-year-old could not have walked that far. He said the only logical explanation was that someone carried the child that far. Who would carry a toddler 12 miles into the wilderness at night and leave him alive in the snow? Let us return to Charles McCullough and Crater Lake's strange mystery. Crater Lake is one of North America's most beautiful and dangerous places. The lake is a volcanic caldera with sheer cliffs that plunge into the water. The park gets some of the most snow in the U.S., often over 40 feet per year. Charles arrived in January 1974 to find the park covered in a thick layer of snow and a massive winter storm dumping feet of fresh powder. The 19-year-old amateur photographer Charles was unprepared for this environment. He wore light, non-waterproof clothes, regular boots, and no snowshoes or skis. A tripod and multiple lenses weighed him down when his friend dropped him off. The friend later told police that watching Charles walk into the snow made him feel uneasy. He thought Charles was completely out of his depth and didn't understand the winter mountains' dangers. Extreme weather hampered the search after Charles disappeared. The days after his disappearance, over 5 feet of snow covered any clues or tracks. Avalanche coverlands on the caldera's steep slopes threatened the searchers. Even though they tried, they found nothing. Charles's father spent months searching for his son's body or camera gear in the spring's melting snow. He found nothing. Charles seemed to vanish into another dimension. Unexpectedly, the backpack was found 12 miles from the trailhead a year later. 2 lost hikers found Charles's backpack in a remote, densely forested area far from where he was dropped off. The police found Charles's keys, including the Volkswagen key, in the pack. His remains were found in a surreal state by investigators. His feet bones were still in his socks, which were sticking out of his unbuttoned pants on a log. There were no boots, jacket, or upper skeleton. His skull was 12 feet away. Official explanations of natural causes and animal scavenging fail scrutiny. Scavenging animals like bears, wolves, and coyotes tear clothing and scatter bones over a large area. They don't unbutton pants, leave them neatly on a log, and leave the feet bones in the socks while carrying the entire skeleton away without a trace. Also unusual are the missing boots and jacket. Charles would not have taken off his boots and jacket and walked 12 miles in deep snow if he was freezing. How did he go 12 miles off trail in 7 feet of snow? Every step in deep snow without snowshoes causes post-holing, which sinks to the waist. An exhausted person like Charles carrying heavy camera gear would have been hypothermic within a mile, let alone 12. Physical evidence indicates a highly anomalous event that the official report ignored. Let's investigate Bart Schleier's Yukon case. Alaska borders the vast, wild Yukon in northwest Canada. It has massive mountains, wild rivers, and endless spruce and pine forests. It has some of North America's largest grizzly, wolf, and moose populations. It was the perfect playground for Bart, an outdoorsman. With decades of wilderness tracking and survival experience, he was strong and mentally tough. The campsite was eerie when Bart's pilot picked him up 3 weeks later. The camp was tidy. The tent was secure, Bart's sleeping bag was out, and his belongings were organized. Food was unattended on the camp table. Food attracts wild animals in the wilderness. If a grizzly bear killed Bart, it would have raided the campsite because it can smell food from miles away. Opportunistic feeders, bears will tear through tents and gear to find food. The camp was untouched, indicating no large predators were nearby. The dry bag and bow and arrow found near the tree were also odd. The dry bag had an indentation indicating that Bart had been waiting for a moose for hours. His fully strung bow rested against the tree. The ground yielded several of Bart's teeth and a few bone fragments. No blood, torn clothing, or struggle was evident. A typical predator attack on a human is violent and chaotic. Grizzlies and wolves don't kill grown men quietly and cleanly. There would be broken branches, blood on the leaves and ground, and deep predator tracks. There would be ripped clothes and gear. Bart's sitting spot had perfect ground. His teeth and a few bone fragments were all that remained of him after he disappeared. Bart's experienced trackers and outdoorsman friends rejected the official bear attack theory. Bart was an awareness master, they said. He spent his life tracking tigers in Siberia, where one mistake could kill. He constantly monitored and read the wind. They couldn't believe a large grizzly bear could have sneaked up on Bart in broad daylight while he was hunting and alert without him hearing a sound or having time to grab his bow. They believed whatever had taken Bart was a supernatural creature that could silently attack and kill a master tracker without a fight. Finally, let's revisit Christopher Tompkins' terrifying Harris County, Georgia disappearance. Harris County borders Alabama in west-central Georgia. It has farmland, rolling hills, and dense southern pine forests. Christopher worked on a quiet, rural highway with a barbed wire fence and thick woods. The survey team was well organized. They walked in a single file line along the road 50 feet apart. They could communicate visually and verbally while measuring with this spacing. Christopher walked at the back, anchoring the line. Christopher was closely monitored by the surveyor ahead of him to ensure they were on track. Christopher vanished on a tight timeline. The surveyor saw Christopher walking normally and turned back. His turnaround took less than 60 seconds, and Christopher was gone. No sound was heard for that brief moment. The road was quiet, and the other 3 crew members were nearby. Christopher would have made a sound if he had been attacked by an animal, run away, or been grabbed. A shout, scream, branch breaking, or dirt road scuffle would have occurred. There was nothing. Heavy, complete silence. The ground and fence debris are disturbing. Christopher's neat pile of loose change and pocket tools suggests a violent movement that inverted him and dropped his pockets onto the road. It's also odd that his heavy work boot was found wedged in the barbed wire fence 8 feet up. Fully laced and tied boot. A foot must be pulled out of a laced tied boot with such force that it wedges the boot into the wire. Christopher appears to have been lifted vertically, and his boot snagged on the fence, ripping it off as he disappeared into the sky or dense canopy above. Christopher was searched extensively with tracking dogs and teams. No scent trail was found by the dogs. They would walk to where his coins and tools were found and then lose the scent, as if Christopher had vanished. He found his other boot 9 months later near a swamp 900 yards away. This second boot was also tied. Nothing else of Christopher's remains or clothing was found near it in the mud. The discovery did not answer anything. It only deepened the mystery and horror of his fate. When viewed together, these 5 cases show why they are so important to the missing 411 phenomenon. They form an inexplicable disappearance pattern. These are not situations where people got lost, panicked, and died from exposure. The physical laws of nature, human capability, and animal behavior seem to have been completely upended. Whether you believe in a rational, undiscovered explanation or the paranormal, these events are chilling. Beautiful and majestic, the wilderness holds deep, dark secrets. As we hike and camp under the stars, we must remember that we are visitors in a world we don't understand, and that the deep woods may hold unsolvable mysteries. These mysteries have plagued Dennis Martin, Keith Parkins, Charles McCullough, Bart Schleyer, and Christopher Tompkins' families for decades. Some found relief in survival, but frustration in a blank memory. The grim discovery of partial remains left others wondering how their loved ones died. Some have endured decades of silence without closure or peace. A mysterious moment in the wilderness took their loved ones and left behind a trail of confusing clues and unanswered questions, changing their lives forever. 5 people's stories demonstrate the North American wilderness's mystery. All outdoor enthusiasts are warned by them. Never take your safety for granted. Always be prepared and aware of your surroundings. The vast, deep woods may hold secrets that humans may never discover. Looking at the trees and mountains, we wonder what happened to those who vanished and what forces are at play in our world's wild places. These cases' legal and official aftermaths can be as frustrating for families as the disappearances. In many of these cases, the National Park Service and local sheriff departments quickly close the case and attribute the deaths to natural causes or animal attacks. They do this to keep parks safe and orderly. National parks generate a lot of tourism and revenue, so they want to avoid the idea of an unsolved, possibly paranormal danger in the woods. In these rare cases, cover-ups, ignored evidence, and lack of transparency have resulted. David Paulides' research has illuminated these issues, forcing the public and authorities to examine patterns and physical evidence. He has spoken up for families who felt ignored by official investigations. His books and documentaries have started a vital conversation about safety, search and rescue protocols, and the need for a centralized, transparent database of missing people in public lands, but they do not provide a definitive answer. Until such a system is implemented, the missing will remain a mystery, and the deep woods will hold their secrets. Many thanks for watching. Comment your thoughts on today's episode. And remember, you can binge on our true crime playlist right now. Till next time. See you.